Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. This is Haig, Jeremy, and our guest today is Bruce Momjian. I got the privilege of staying at Bruce's house for a year when I was a seminary student. They welcomed me into their home for free, which was amazing, and they fed me a lot. And during that time when I was a student, they provided shelter and food, and we got to have wonderful conversations. And I want to bring one of those conversations to you today on the Christ and Coffee podcast. Bruce, welcome. It's so good to have you.
Hey, great to be here.
Bruce, you're kind of a big deal in the computer science world. You are a co-founder of Postgres. So for me, trying to understand it one more time, and for our viewers, what is it that you co-founded?
Yeah, it's a huge mystery, because my job is so unusual. When I would talk to people at church, they weren't sure quite what I did because I was home a lot and then I'd disappear to these unusual countries and then I'd come back again and then I'd be home for a while and then I'd disappear again. And
he's a spy.
Yeah, I got all the, he's a Russian something or, Chinese,
sleeper agent.
Or, just drug dealer. I got that one too. CIA because most people go to a physical location for an office and they work with colleagues and there's a company associated with what they do. And I don't really have any of that. I mean, I've worked at home since 92, 94.
So you were quarantine ready before everyone was forced.
Yeah, there was almost no change. Although the other aspect of what I do is obviously not only do I work from home, but I travel, typically pre-quarantine, about 90 days a year. So about a quarter of the year you're out in different countries, Asia, Europe, Latin America, pretty widespread in terms of where you go, different place almost every time. So that's just a weird dynamic. The reason for that is because unlike a company where I work for a company, but most of my effort is involved in working with volunteers who write software. A lot of the infrastructure that we work with in terms of web servers, database servers, application farms, even the applications that we're using right now are really foundationally built on open source software that's developed by volunteers. So I'm just in that little database niche. Obviously we're incredibly popular now. So, that's why I have so many events I have to attend. But that's why it's such an odd job because you're not attached to a traditional enterprise with your time. Most of your time is mostly online, talking to people and also traveling.
So what do you mean by open source database?
Yeah. So traditionally, software was developed by companies. So IBM, Microsoft, they would write software and they would publish it, and you'd purchase it. You'd install it on your computer, and then you'd have a license to use it, and they would produce upgrades every couple of years. Starting in the early 90s with the dawn of first floppy disks. And then the internet, you now have the ability for software to flow between people much more easily. And as soon as that flow became popular, you could all of a sudden harness volunteers around the world to build software. Instead of building it within a company, you could now have volunteers who would all build it together. And I started that I did some open source stuff before 96, but 96 is when I started with an open source database called Postgres, and I've been doing that for 24 years now. But we have people in almost every country. We don't have a whole lot of people in Africa or the Middle East, but all the other continents we're very, every country in those continents we have volunteers. And, we have a way we communicate via email mostly. We have a central repository for the software. And we have, thousands of people every day working on improving that software. And we put out a new release every year and it's free. So what's not to like?
So what is the software used for? How does it utilize?
So it would be it's a database. So it would be used by any application that needed some type of permanent storage.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a bank, if you're Zoom, if you're Skype, if you're a credit card company, if you are a retailer, if you have a copier and you want to record all of the copies that have been made, those need some kind of permanent storage.
Mm-hmm.
And typically any application needs permanent storage is going to use some kind of database.
Mm-hmm.
So we're used by all the big credit card companies, all the big telcos, all the big banks, most of the airlines, almost all the car companies, certainly all of the IT technology companies use us. So there really isn't any market segment that doesn't need that type of data storage.
What about social media sites?
Yeah, so social media sites, they certainly use us. They may not use us exclusively because social media sites have a tendency to have huge data volumes where the data itself is not super critical. Like if you make a charge, like that's a big piece of data. If you're just tweeting something, you may not necessarily use our software for that. You might use our software to keep track of all the user accounts and all of the the statuses and where they live and stuff like that. But all the tweets or all of maybe the blogs, you may use a different piece of software for that. That's more lightweight or more designed for high velocity data. So we're not the exclusive one that you'd use, but we're certainly part of any solution that you would set up usually.
Wow.
So if I understand, I just want to understand correctly. So it's kind of like in the language, maybe I would understand. It's like you're on the grassroots level with software developers, and then you are crafting database programs, or you're working with people, collaborating with people to create database programs that hold and store the world's information, right? I mean, some of the most important information. So how does that coincide with like cloud database?
So all of the cloud providers use our software. So Amazon RDS, Amazon Aurora, Google Cloud, IBM, Microsoft, Alibaba in China. I don't think there's a cloud provider that doesn't use our software pretty significantly.
So every cloud system needs database software that will hold it and run it. Is that correct?
Well, it might be used to. You might use the database software to manage the accounts of the cloud customers.
Got it.
Or you might have cloud customers who are using your database for their uses.
Got it.
Right. So it might be part of the cloud management process, or it might be just something that, a cloud is just a container of a virtual computer, and the customer decide, I want the database to be my container. So you're seeing a huge amount of that. And because we're free, we're very lightweight, we're very flexible. That's why even companies that have their own databases like Microsoft, right? You'd think they have Microsoft SQL Server. Why would they want our database? Well, our database has a lot of advantages against theirs, particularly in the cloud. So they're very positive and very supportive of our database, even though they have their own. Same thing with IBM. They have DB2, but they promote Postgres very heavily.
Wow. Can we backtrack and can you tell us the story of how you ended up in this field? Because I know, did you study history and math before you entered into the computer world?
Yeah. You're really going way back there. So, even when I was in junior high school, I remember being really fascinated by computers. And at that time, it was programmable calculators. We didn't have computers in the 70s in a personal way like they do now. So, I remember being really into that. And then when I was in high school, I was really into computers, but I was probably too much into it, I would say. So I think it was my junior year in high school. I said, I said, this computer stuff is really starting to kind of subsume my personality. I was becoming obsessed with it, or I was just becoming too engrossed in it. And I realized I wasn't fully developing my personality and who I am. So I basically walked away from computers for about 5 years. So I went to Columbia in New York. I studied history, and didn't do anything with computers. And then when I got out of college, I did some unusual jobs. I repaired construction equipment. That's probably the most unusual job I've ever had. I used to repair jackhammers. I mean, who would have thought that that was a job? Um, and then over time, I got into education. I got a master's in education. And there was obviously a huge need for mathematics and computer science teachers. So I had the skill. I had been away from computers at that point for 8 years or so. So I said, okay, I've developed other parts of my personality. I've got a master's in education. I've got my history degree. I'm going to get back into computers. And I spent, I guess 2 years teaching math and then 3 years teaching computer science in high schools in Philadelphia. And then when I got married, I got a job as a computer consultant. So I did applications for law firms, and probably the first thing that grabbed me right away was this database thing, which I'd really not focused on up until that point. And that was, my job was to write applications that use this data store, right? Remember I said earlier, every application that needs permanent storage is going to have to need some kind of database. So I was always fascinated about how they worked. And about, I guess, 94, 95, 96, I started to say, I'd really like to download the source code. Open source becoming popular in the mid 90s. I'd like to download the source code of a database, not necessarily the one I'm using at work, but just anyone. And I want to see how it works. Like, how do they do this? Like, what does the code look like? How does it accomplish the things that it does? And I tried a couple different databases and downloaded them. And the one that really stuck, that was most like the commercial database I was using, was Postgres. It had been developed by that point for 10 years, originally developed in University of California, Berkeley. But by 1996, it was kind of on its way out. It wasn't being developed much anymore. And I said, this database is kind of nice. It's got a lot of bugs, which I found pretty quickly. But I said, I feel like we can, if it was given the right management and the right structure, it could actually be something. It could become popular because it had potential. And that's why in 96, myself with another gentleman, Mark Fournier, sort of created a team we already had about 100 users, or a bunch of users who were using it, but they weren't organized. They were sending in fixes, but the fixes weren't getting applied. There wasn't a structure of how do you marshal a team to improve this software. That's really what you start with, right? You got a bunch of users. They're complaining about bugs. Some other people are fixing the bugs. How do you bring those two together, package it, get it out, and get into a cycle where the more fixes that come in, the better the software gets, and so forth. And that same cycle has been going on now for 24 years with dozens of companies now, involved in our project. Some huge ones, Fujitsu, NTT, in Japan, some big ones in the US, some big ones in Europe that are, which have staff who work on our software, but again, all for free and all to be released for free.
It's interesting. It strikes me, just kind of as we're talking, your process is not too unlike what most of us do as pastors in churches of trying to marshal together a team and restore a software that may have had bugs in the past or needs some tweaks and changes. And you work in systems. It seems like you work in systems and fixing systems to set them straight and restore them to rights. And it seems like that's something that is sort of a divine call, not just on you, but on many.
Yeah, one of the things that I've learned, and I think a lot of people in leadership positions kind of leave this value on the table, but listening to other leaders, listening to how people inspire others. John Maxwell is probably the biggest, I think, well-known leadership speaker, and also a pastor. So went from pastorate to sort of leadership coach. And, he has one great talk where he talks about being a servant leader. Basically says there's 7 types of leaders. There's the inspirational leader. There's the bureaucratic leader. There's the, you know, and then there's the servant leader, which is there to serve the people who are under their charge and to bring the best out of them. And a lot of people who are in leadership positions, I feel, just kind of wing it. Okay, this worked, this didn't work, you know, and I'm just going to keep going that way. Sometimes I'll sit and I'll watch a video, sometimes on YouTube, John Maxwell or somewhere else. There's a LeaderCast conference I attend every year. Craig Rochelle has one, pastor. He has a leadership event every year. I think it's in August this year. And Christine and we usually go, and you know, I listen, and if I walk out of there and I learn one thing or how to be a better leader, that's gonna, you know, for the rest of my life, I'm that much better. You know.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is really not only figuring out what works, but studying it, or at least being attentive to understand what types of activities are bearing fruit and what type of activities really are not. You know, I remember early on, you know, I'm a pretty good developer, but early on I realized that when I started working with the global volunteers, these people were like 100 times better than I was. You know, I mean, I was good, but when you're good in your little field, you know, but when you're now, you've got a global team, you know, some of these people are just amazing. They're just astounding compared to you. And I realized that one of the values that I can bring to the team is not to sit and program, but to make those people more effective. Right. So, you know, I can program for one day and get one day's worth of work out, but if I can get 10 people to do that in a day, I got 10 people's work out of it. Right. So a lot of what I try and do is to say, okay, maybe I'm not supposed to do that. Maybe I'm better off creating structures, creating training materials, visiting these people. That's one of the reasons I travel so much. Maybe that's a better use of my time than sitting at a keyboard and trying to solve a particular technical problem. Not that I can't, but what is the output versus inspiring others and getting them, you know, on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a very fascinating thing. You realized that your involvement with computers consumed you and you wanted to work on your identity. I feel like what you just described is pretty much every human being right now. What are some of your concerns with like so you lived through the transition from non-computers to computers. Like, what are some of your concerns to the development of human society now that computers are so part of the mainstream? Everyone is attached to their phones. What are your thoughts on what is this doing, both positively and negatively, and any advice for people who may be too much on their computers? As someone who has pushed for computers?
Yeah, it's I'm going to answer that two ways. I think for me personally, it was striking a balance, you know, in understanding that I'm good at this thing and therefore I want to do more of it, but maybe that's not fully using all of my skills, right? So, you know, it's hard to imagine that, you know, I remember when I decided I was going to get a master's in education, my dad was like, you know, he wanted me to be a lawyer. He wasn't. The idea of me being a teacher for 20 or 30 years or 40 years really he didn't think that was a good direction for me or for career-wise, whatever. And I was like, you know, I understand your concern, but this is what I need to do. And you know, it's surprising that the types of things I learned in doing that and speaking, you know, to a group for hours and hours every day, which is what you do as a teacher, right? You know, really has tremendously helped me as a leader, you know, and particularly traveling to all these events. I remember going to my first event. It was in San Diego. I think it was in 99 or 2000. And I fly to California, and hotel was right on the water. And, you know, it's a 3-day, 4-day event. And, you know, I get up to speak for my slot. There's probably 30 people there. And I give my talk, and then I walk around some more and I have lunch or whatever. And then I gave another talk and I did that. And I flew home, and I'm in the plane. And I'm thinking, well, there's 4 days wasted. I mean, I flew to California. I probably spoke to 50 people. When I send an email out, I'm speaking to thousands of people, right? What's the value in going to California and doing all this? So I thought, okay, this travel thing's not for me. This conference stuff's not for me. But the week or two after I got back, I realized there was a tremendous amount of activity in terms of the software and in terms of people being involved and motivated. And I realized it was a lot of the people that I had lunch with in the cafeteria at the conference who were now motivated. And I realized that it was me being there in person, spending time talking to them, talking about talking to them as people, not as technology people, but getting to know them, just showing that we care about them and so forth, that really kind of engage those people. And I think to your larger question of how computers are going to balance things out, if you look historically, there's been concern that technology would sort of subsume large parts of society, way back. So, if you look at the radio, for example, you think of the old pictures, people listening to the radio. I know it sounds very archaic now, but there was a huge number of radio dramas, which I'm actually a fan of, in those early years, and there was a sense that the radio was going to subsume society. And then there was a concern that television, and I don't know, you're probably too young, but the concept that we're going to eat dinner watching the TV, and we're going to spend all our evenings watching TV. And even today, when you talk about how much time people spend watching TV, it's somewhat lower, but it's still fairly high, particularly outside developed countries. But then when you start to add screen time in there, right, then you start to see this huge, and I think what every new technology brings this, and this is true across the board, every new technology brings this, oh, this is going to be the greatest thing. It's going to change your life, and you're not going to want to live without it, right? Could be Facebook, right? Could be the personal computer, right? Could be the next thing that happens in 10 years. But every time technology comes, there's this hype cycle. It's actually the term, where new technology appears. Everyone gets super excited about it. It's going to solve all the problems known to man, right? And then it gets to the top, and then it sort of plops down. And then it basically levels out at where it should have started to begin with. And I think we've even seen that in terms of social media. I think you and I both, all three of us, have lived long enough to see social media kind of take the world by storm as something you can't live without. It's something that's going to define you. To now, we're kind of at the point where people are saying, I'm kind of walked away from Facebook. I'm not doing Twitter anymore. Maybe I'm doing Instagram. Maybe I'm doing something else. But people are coming, hopefully, to that balance again. But you're absolutely right. It's a combination of the hype cycle and people thinking these new technology is going to do these amazing things, and it never will. Only Christ is going to change your life. It's not going to be Facebook, right? It sounds passé to say that now, but if I said that when Facebook was on the rise, people would be like, I know, but Facebook. Yeah, so we've kind of seen that go. We've seen Facebook go through that hype cycle already, I think. Yeah. But the second point is more interesting, that people are responsible for how they spend the time God gives them. And you really have to. Yeah, I was on the phone with somebody yesterday in Russia, and we did a Skype call, and I said, I said, we're not entitled to anything. I said, every day, and this person's, not a Christian, but I said, every day is a gift, and you're given that day, and you've got to figure out what you're going to do with that day, right? Is that going to be, is that going to be social media? Is that going to be binge watching Netflix? Is it going to be YouTube? Is it going to be praying? Is it going to be spending time with your family? Is it going to be reading your Bible? Is it going to be watching Christ and Coffee recordings, right? I mean, what is it going to be? And you know, you have to have a balance of that. Christ, when he was here, I'm always thinking, you know, Christ wants us to just sit and read our Bible all day. I don't think so. I don't see Christ reading the Torah all day, right? So he did read, but again, he had a balance. He spent time with people. He spent a lot of time in social settings, you know, you know, if we were to translate that into today, it would be like a bar or a restaurant or some type of family gathering, right? So I'm always trying to understand how Christ did the balance, and then I'm trying to extrapolate that to today and trying to say, well, that's what I should do next. One of the weird things, and I explained this to somebody, and they told me, you know, when I was a consultant for 11 years, and during that period, I had to record every 15-minute segment of time that I spent. So, you had an 8-hour day, and you would record, you know, okay, for this 45 minutes, I worked on this customer and I did this. And that's how you would build a customer. And it was hard in the beginning, but after a while you got used to it, and you started to see time as an asset that had to be managed. And you don't have the luxury of I'm just going to watch 5 episodes of something right now. Or I'm going to watch a football game. I'm not a sport guy, so you know, it's easy for me to pick on that. But everything that I do has an impact on something I'm not doing. And is that something I'm not doing something where I should be improving my relationship with my family, my relationship with God? I should improving my skill set. I should be improving my leadership skills, or my skills in understanding how to be a better father, or, you know, personal development, right? Or is it time to just relax and do nothing, right? And I find that if I discipline my life, if I don't let these fun things distract me, then I work X hours a day, and I get to a point and I'm like, I'm done, right? So at a certain point, I'm like, okay, I have accomplished enough today for all of the things I'm responsible for. And now it's time for me to relax. And that's, again, another huge thing that I think, you know, and certainly the Sabbath is part of that. We could have a whole session, I think, just about the Sabbath. But, you know, every day should have some Sabbath in it that's not focused on, you know, material gain or career gain or whatever. And how do you balance that out? But you're right. It's every new technology brings with it a distraction. And we're always having to relearn, oh, that distraction from Facebook, that probably wasn't necessarily what I wanted to spend my time on that day, or that distraction on Twitter or whatever. And there's, you know, sometimes wiser people consciously just avoid those things. Like, okay, I know that if I got involved in X technology, that it would just consume so much of my time that I just don't even want to go there, because I know it would just suck up needless time for me.
Yeah.
And that's a hard decision to make, particularly if everyone else is right. excited about some technology that's come out.
You're missing out on the hype. You have to join the hype cycle.
You can wait for the hype cycle to go down, and then you look like a genius.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there is a long-term value to that, right? But at the time, it's a little hard. Why are you not on it? I remember I got on LinkedIn because one of my employees said, you really need to get on it. And I was actually on it today for a different reason. But what I also realized is when I went to some events, somebody would come up to me and they'd say, hey, I asked for a link on LinkedIn and you didn't reply, you know? And I'm like, I'm sorry. I check LinkedIn like every 2 months or something. I didn't see it, you know? And I saw that as a microcosm of what would happen if I got on Facebook. Right.
Yeah.
And I was like, is this really where I want to be?
Yeah.
And it's almost to the point where if something important happens, somebody tells me about it. Like, I've got people who monitor that stuff, and they will IM me. I have a whole bunch of IM clients and IM software installed. And they'll say, this happened to X. And I'm like, oh, okay, let me call them right away or whatever.
Yeah.
So I kind of let other people filter that for me because I know that's probably not where I should be spending my time. But it's a continual challenge, and we're seeing it. Years ago, how long did radio last? Right, that was a multi-decade dominance. And then television still has a very significant place. And that's, I guess, 70 years or so, in process. And now we're seeing, platforms come and go within years, right? Facebook was huge. What was it, 4 years ago? And now people are like, I'm not as excited about it anymore, right? And then Instagram kind of popped up, and then there's a couple other ones that kind of came and went real quick. So yeah, you're seeing a lot quicker change. So therefore, you have to be more judicious in where you're going to spend your time and what technology could potentially just completely overwhelm you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Haig, I think you have a love-hate relationship with Augustine, but I find him very interesting. I'm fairly into him, but it's fascinating as you told that story and weaved in that narrative together. It seemed terribly Augustinian. There's this whole concept in Augustine's teaching of disordered desire or disordered love, and seeking out these hype cycles of life, not just technology, but hype cycles in life, this thing that we want or this thing we cling to. And his antidote most of the time is grace, which is exactly what you came to. It's every day is a gift. What we have in front of us is a gift. Manage it, steward it, discipline life accordingly, and walk in that gift. And so there you go. You've got the tech rendering of Augustinian theology for us in just a couple minutes.
Yeah, Bruce, tell us about your faith. Like, was it something you grew up with or something you discovered?
You might have touched on this in the previous Christ and Coffee episodes, but for me, I always kind of saw God as close. He always sort of felt like he had his hand on my shoulder or something. He was always there, out of reach, of course, but he was always somewhere, doing something. I didn't know what. So I always kind of knew he was there, but I also felt that when I went to the churches that I attended 2 different churches as a kid, I didn't see a whole lot of God there. I just saw a lot of formality and a lot of social activity. But in terms of living out faith, I didn't, it might have, I'm sure it was there. I just didn't see it. And while I was in college, I started to kind of poke around to see, okay, what, I knew Christ was real, but I wasn't sure where he was. And I looked at Quakerism a little bit, which is a Pennsylvania kind of thing. And I looked at a couple other different ones. And I had a dream once when I was in college that I was in this black room. It's dark, completely dark. And there was some kind of figure with a shroud over it, but a light on it. And all of a sudden it lit up. And I knew what was underneath there was pure evil. And I woke up and I was just terrified. I was like, okay, that was terrifying. I don't know where that dream came from, but I realized I had to be pretty serious. And and again, I told you I was poking around, and one of the things I poked around on in the early 80s was shortwave radio, because you didn't have the internet back then didn't exist, right? So the way that countries would communicate was shortwave radio, because radio, going back to the radio concept from earlier, they could broadcast from Germany or Ecuador or Moscow, and because of the way the radio waves go, they propagate across the whole earth, and you can hear them. And I'd listen to shortwave radio. So I guess I always had an interest in other cultures and international activities. And there was a radio show out of Ecuador. The station was HCJB. I think it was Herald in Christ Jesus Blessing was the name. And it was just a Christian radio station. And they had a whole bunch of different programs about culture in Latin America, which I was always interested in. And they would talk about shortwave radio technology and different models that were coming out, and how it worked. It was just kind of interesting. I'd listen. And they had one show where they just like a round table, exactly what we're doing here. There's probably 3 or 4 of them. You couldn't see them because it was radio, right? But they would just be sitting around the table talking about what was going on in Ecuador. They were in Quito at that point, and what was going on in Ecuador, and how, what they were doing to help people, or they would interview people and stuff like that. And I would listen to the show, and it hit me one day that these people had something that I wanted, and I was never going to get it by trying to figure it out on my own. And that was probably the most humbling thing. I approached religion as something I wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand what was God, what was Christ, why was he here, all these things. And I realized these people had a peace and had a love and a joy that I didn't have. And no matter how much I thought and thought and thought and thought, I was never going to have it. And that was probably the second big act of, sort of epiphany for me. That I was not going to figure my way into faith and into understanding who God was. I had to accept. You see that term a lot, but you don't. I guess you don't. For me, I always approach it as the acceptance is the sort of antithesis of trying to understand it yourself, right? But for me, acceptance was something that I had to come to terms with. And I realized listening to, I think, probably the clearest one I can think of was another radio show. Wow, there's a lot of radio here. Unshackled was out of Chicago, Pacific Garden Mission.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a radio drama that ran into the 80s, and it probably still runs, where they would have a half hour where they would go through somebody's life who made a decision for Christ. And they weren't sanitized. They were very, I don't want to say crudely done, but they were very raw in terms of who these people were, mm-hmm. and how they came to accept Christ. And I think I started to understand, I just have to accept this. I know he's there, but I'm not going to figure God out from here, period. Right.
Right.
And I've just got to accept it. So I think I want to say 84, probably 84. I think I made a prayer. I remember where I was. It's like, God, I don't know who you are, but I accept you, and I accept your son. And, that was, I remember just my life just completely, really, my outlook and the frustration of not being able to figure God out obviously went away. And I could just kind of sit and say, okay, here's who he is. I'm not going to fully understand him. I need to learn to love him, to know him better, but it's not my job to figure God out. And I think that was the big stumbling block that I had to get over. And from there, I started attending a church in my hometown under a very gifted pastor who was a single man, and we became very close. And I attended all his. He was a learned Old Testament scholar guy. So in terms of intellect and the way he approached faith, it was an amazing fit for me. And then obviously when I got married, I wasn't able to attend there anymore, but then, moved into churches in this area and kept continuing to attend since then.
Yeah, I just double checked, and Unshackled is still on the airwaves out of Chicago, Pacific Garden Mission. It's still running strong. So it's a testament to your journey. I could go down a whole road of Anselm because what you said just ran right into Anselmian theology, but I'll take a pause and save our listeners from having to go through that.
Like what is?
Yeah, exactly. Just, but yeah. So Bruce, we just want to say thank you for sitting in and having this conversation with us today. This has been a real pleasure to talk to you and get to know you. Haig lived with you for so long, so he knows your story, but it was really refreshing for me to sit down and get to know a little bit about what makes you tick and how you came to be who you are today. And so I appreciate your story, and I'm thankful for the time we got to spend together. Like you said, our time is valuable. It's an asset. So I'm glad you got to share it with us and that we got to spend the time with you. And looking forward to continuing conversations. You're in our little tribe, so we'll run into you again soon. But thank you for the time you spent with us today. God bless you. And everybody out there listening, have a great week. God bless you. And as Haig always says, stay caffeinated.
Take care, everyone. Good to see you.